This is Kathy Roth from the Middlefield Heritage Society welcoming Ralph Bell Jr. to share stories and photos of his father, Ralph Bell Sr. This is the fifth video in a series called Middlefield Memories, a project started in 2014 to record and honor the lives of our older residents in the history of Middlefield, Massachusetts. Each video has been funded by a grant from the Middlefield and Massachusetts Cultural Councils. Ralph, thank you for being part of this endeavor to capture some of the life of your father and the history of the town during the period he lived in Middlefield. Would you begin by telling us when and how the Bell family first came to Middlefield?
The Bell family first came to Middlefield with my grandfather, Ralph Bell Sr., whose name was actually Raphael DiPietro, and he came and lived with the Bells here in Pittsfield after his mother passed away, and his father went back to Italy to remarry, and so he lived with the Bells, and then he was taken back after his father got back from Italy with the new wife, who was actually his sister-in-law. He then lived in Westerly, Rhode Island for a period, and his father put him to work in a roller skates factory, which he didn't care too much for. So he ran away, and I'm not sure how old he was at that point, but he ran away back to Middlefield and came back up to the Bells, George Bell, and at that point Mr. Bell said, no, you can't stay, you have to go back with your family. So they somehow got him back down there, whether it was on the train or whatever, and he stayed down there for a little while, and he used to stop at his sister's, who was a little bit older than him, and have peanut butter on the way home from school or whatever, peanut butter and crackers. Then his sister said, you're not very happy, are you, here? And he says, no, he wanted to go back up to the Bells. So she gave him the money to go on the train, and he came back up. And Mr. Bell says, oh, no, you can't stay. But he called or got a hold of Mr. DiPietro either through the mail or however, and said, your son is back up here. And he said, well, you might as well keep him. So that was it. He stayed, from then he stayed here. Years later, his brothers wanted him to come back down there, and so they came up to get him. And at that point, he had met my grandmother, and they hadn't been married, but they were quite serious at that point, and I'm not sure how old they were, but not too old, probably in their either early 20s or late teens. And the two brothers saw my grandmother, who had real red hair and quite a pretty young lady, and they said, he's never coming back with us. So that was kind of, that was how he got here, was because he came and lived with the Bells and liked it. Apparently liked Middlefield. They then bought the farm on Bell Road, and how they paid for that, there's some story. I think his father in the meantime had died, but of course he wasn't left anything. But his brothers and sisters got together and gave him some money from his father's estate, basically, and they each gave it in some, and I think it was around $800 or $900, and that was what they put down as a down payment on their farm, on Blossom Corner over there. Yeah, and that was how they started into farming.
What did your father raise on the farm? Was that his source of income?
He raised cattle, dairy. It was a dairy farm. He started as a dairy farmer, and they grew hay and corn, potatoes. During the Depression, I can remember somebody said that my grandmother had a bill for the whole month, and it was to buy 32 cents worth of yeast cake. The rest of the stuff came off of the farm. You had to raise bread. um, yeah, then my Aunt Rosina was the first one born to them, and then my father was 2 years younger. Um, Then my Aunt Mary, who was his sister, was born 2 years after my father. Then his brother George, who was 8 years younger than my father, was born. And there were four. There were four siblings. I don't know too many stories about it. I have some pictures of them that you saw of him with my Aunt Rosina when he was roughly 2 years old, and pictures on up of it until they were a little bit older.
Did he take part in the fair?
In the fair? Um, well, that's a constant. Yeah, I guess he did. When he was a boy, of course, they had cattle, so I'm sure they went to cattle show. But there's some pictures of him when he was a boy with leading a cow around. And then one of the pictures we have is of his graduating class from Chester High School. And that was in 1932, I believe, during the Depression. He did not he stayed on the farm for a year after graduating from high school because there just weren't any jobs to speak of. So then then Mr. Smith, who had a summer place here in Middlefield and was a patent attorney in Boston, talked to my father and my grandfather and told them about Wentworth Institute in Boston, which was a 2-year technical school in tool and mold tool making. There were other courses, but the tool making was one that seemed to interest my father the most. And Mr. Smith made it quite possible for him to go there, as my grandfather didn't have money enough to really send him to school. So he went down and he did odd jobs for Mr. Smith, and he stayed there at their home. And Mr. Smith who had a daughter whose name was Dorothy Cummings, who they spent a lot of time here in Middlefield. And my father used to do odd jobs for them when he was a kid, also mowing the lawns and that type of thing. He went to Wentworth. The first year he lived with the Smiths. The second year he had two other friends that they had an apartment together. One of the fellows was from Maine, and the other fellow was from down near Boston, somewhere in that area. And they had an apartment together, and that was the second year. But my grandmother would bake up a raccoon or something, and they would take it back with them on the weekends and leave it sitting on the windowsill where it was cool, and they would eat off of that for the week. But none of these people had much money in those days, so they were all very, very frugal, put it mildly, I guess. After graduating from Wentworth in 1935, there were still very limited jobs. Nobody was hiring anybody. It was still Depression. But they did manage to get a job out in Ohio at Irwin Augerbit. And I believe that there were three of the fellows went out there to work. And one of the stories that my father tells me is that they went in, and I forgot how much money they got, but it wasn't a lot of money, of course, back in those days. So they went into to work, and they worked 5 days, and so then on Saturday they started touring Ohio, basically, or in that area. And so they came in on Monday morning, and the boss, whoever he was, says, "Where were you guys Saturday?" "Oh, we're supposed to work Saturdays?" He says, "Well, you work half a day Saturday for your pay." So they got docked the first week because they weren't there on Saturday. That was part of the part of the week. It wasn't a 5-day week. It was a 6-day week, 5.5 days anyway. So he didn't stay too long, as I gather from. I'm a little unsure of how long he was out there, but I do know he had a girlfriend out there. That because I saw a picture somewhere of this lady, and but that was pretty short term. When he came back here, that was kind of the end of the relationship with this lady friend that he had there. When he came back here, he was able to get employed by the General Electric. They were hiring tool makers, and he was a tool maker, so they hired him into the plastics. He worked in the plastics department there. And they built plastic injection molds, and that was probably somewhere around 36 or 1936, 37. He then at that point, my mother, who came up to Middlefield in the summer and worked at the big house as a waitress, and whatever else they did, they took care of the guests there, and changing the sheets on the bed and whatever, probably. My grandfather had told my mother, he said, "Gee, you should meet my father, or my son, my dad." And so she said, "Oh, sure, that would be great, you know." Well, they met, and apparently hit it off pretty well. They ended up eloping in 1938, I guess it was, 1938. They were married January 14th, I believe, 1938. Kathleen Teresa Carlin was her maiden name, and her last name, of course, changed to Bell. They went to Millerton, New York, where they were married. They then came back and they lived in Pittsfield. They had an apartment there, and I wasn't born there was 5 years in there where before I was born. In the meantime, through there, they had bought the Wee House here in Middlefield, which is where Chuck and Barbara Wynn live now. And they renovated it and made it into it was just a summer house, and they made it into a year-round home. At that point, then in 1943, I was born. But my father during the war effort, he was working 7 days a week at the GE out there, 12-hour shifts. And I'm not sure if he worked, I think he might have worked nights, a lot of it, because I can remember him telling about whenever the sun started to come up, whatever, somebody would start yelling, "Daybreak, daybreak," chiming that in. So I think he worked quite a few nights at that point.